Hello everyone, and welcome back to the first video of Dominion 102, the next segment in my Dominion tutorial series. In this video, we're going to talk about interaction in Dominion. There are lots of ways you can interact with your opponents, and though I'm not playing with an opponent this game, I want to get you thinking about how interaction works, and particularly how that's going to shape the course of the game and how you can adjust your strategy to adapt to that interaction. So, before we had mentioned attacks, and we're already probably familiar with militia. An opponent plays a militia, and you have to discard your two least favorite cards from your hand. Playing with a 3-card hand makes it much more difficult to get to $8. Well, there's another attack that I haven't explicitly mentioned, but you've probably seen by this point. And it's a whole genre of attacks that we refer to as cursing attacks or junking attacks. So let's take a look at which. Which costs $5, gives you 2 cards when you play it, which is a small benefit. But the big part is every other player gains a curse card. And if you remember the curses, there are these purple guys down here. They don't do anything, and they're worth -1 victory points. So, you pretty much never buy curses on your own accord, even though it's legally possible, and of course there are edge cases where you want to. Usually you're given curses by your opponent, and it's pretty bad to have curses in your deck. It's no fun. You got to draw them and they do nothing. Not only does it decrease the density of money that you've got in your deck, but it also makes it more difficult for the action cards you want to collide with each other to actually collide. So, these attack cards, the ones with the little red dots beside them on ISO, usually the attack cards, and particularly the stronger ones like discard and junking attacks, really shape the course of the game. If they're available, you can probably assume you're going to get hit by them by any competent opponent. So, if there's Witch on the board, you're probably going to have some curses in your deck. If there's Militia on the board, you're probably going to be playing 3-card hands for a lot of the game. Well, what can you do about it? Well, the obvious thing you can do about it is if your opponent is going to be playing those attacks on you, you should be playing those attacks on your opponent. This is particularly true in 2-player games, when hitting your opponent is just as good as helping yourself, relatively speaking. So if your opponent buys Witch, or even if they don't, you should buy Witch. Every curse that you put in their deck is one less curse that gets put into your deck. And the curse pile in a 2-player game only has 10 copies of the card. So once the curses run out, that gaining a curse card portion of the attack doesn't do anything, and all witches you play just give you 2 cards. Remember, Moat costs a lot less, gave you something else, and just gave you 2 cards. So the benefit itself is not nearly as good as the attack. What else can you do when your opponent will be playing attacks on you? Well, the obvious thing is to defend. We've already talked about the Moat, which just lets you not worry about any attack. So you could buy a ton of Moats, and hopefully you'll have one in hand every time your opponent plays his Witch. Well, having a ton of Moats in your deck is not that much different than having a ton of curses in your deck, because the Moats, while they're better than a curse, aren't that much better. So you're still clogging your deck up. It's an improvement, but usually you can do better by maybe some other forms of defense. Usually attacking your opponent with Witch is better than just buying a bunch of Moats, at least in a 2-player game. Well, what else is there? Let's look at some of these other blue cards. Watchtower. Watchtower's benefit when you play it is draw until you have 6 cards in hand. Usually the same as a Moat, since it usually ends up drawing you 2 cards. But it says when you gain a card, you may reveal this card from your hand. If you do, either trash that card or put it on top of your deck. So if you're about to gain a curse from your opponent, Watchtower trashes it for you. That's pretty nice. Or, if you're about to buy a card and you haven't played your Watchtower, just reveal the Watchtower, put it on top of your deck. Sort of like an extra time you get to play the card super early. So that can be pretty nice. What about a discard attack? If you're facing a discard attack and you don't want to be playing with 3-card hands the whole game, well, there are still options for you there. The first one, let's take a look at Library. It says draw until you have 7 cards in hand. And it also has this additional text that I don't want to get bogged down in right now. So if you started with a 3-card hand, Library draws you a whole bunch more than if you started with a 5-card hand. So if an opponent played a militia on you and you've got a library in hand, discard your two least favorite cards And those two cards that you'll draw from your deck will probably be better than the terrible ones that you discarded. Militia would actually help you if you had a library in hand. That's pretty nice. Another thing, let's take a look at this card, Tunnel. It's a reaction victory card, so it's worth 2 points, but it also has the reaction part of the card. When you discard this other than during a cleanup phase, you may reveal it. If you do, gain a gold. So if I've got a Tunnel in my hand and my opponent plays Militia on me, well, not only has he not hurt me because this card wasn't doing anything in my hand before, but I get a free gold out of it. It's going to make my opponent think twice about even buying Militia, let alone playing the card, when Tunnel is available and I've bought a couple of them. There's also reactive defense. Now you could consider buying your own witches a reactive defense. Well, if you're going to curse me, I'm going to curse you. But there's also trashing. Remember Chapel said trash up to 4 cards from your hand. Well, you can trash curses. Now, this isn't so great as you might think, because you have to draw the Chapel with the curses. And it's very unlikely you're going to get that great hand of Chapel plus 4 curses so they can all go away together. So it's not really that great unless you have some kind of way to draw it all together and still have an action to play your Chapel. But it's a thing. If you stay on top of it and your deck is small, then it's more likely that incoming curses will collide with your Chapel, since there's just not that many other cards to deal with. So even though it's sort of reactive defense, it works a lot better when you're proactive about it. Okay, so there are plenty of attacks in the game, and that's a way you can interact with your opponent. But there are other ways of interaction besides just attacking your opponent. Let's take a look at Council Room. It gives you 4 cards and a buy, which is huge, but it has this clause, each other player draws a card. Every time you play the Council Room, there's a penalty by helping your opponents. So if other people are playing Council Rooms, you could start your turns with 6 card or maybe even more card hands. So the reaction isn't always negative, it's positive. Now, helping your opponent is something you really don't want to do without really thinking about the benefits you're getting as a result of it. So, even though Council Room may be available on the Kingdom, a lot of times people won't buy it because it helps you, which is a little bit different than the attacks, where attacking your opponent is usually a super good thing. Another form of interaction is Masquerade. You draw 2 cards, and then everyone passes a card from their hand to their left. And then, if you've played the Masquerade, you can trash a card from your hand. Could be the one you just got, if it was terrible, or another one in your hand that might have been more terrible than the one you got. Masquerade is another form of interaction, and there are lots of ways that Masquerade can be a significant part in the game. If you've already played a Militia on your opponents, and you've got a Masquerade to play on them, well, if they've only got their best 3 cards to choose from, chances are they're going to have to give you something a lot better than they normally would. Either that, or keep a junky card in hand, just in case they have to pass it to you. So, there's a pretty decent combination there that should be considered. Okay, well, all of these Kingdom cards have interaction, but what if they're not available? Half the games I play may not have any sort of these interactive cards available. And this is a complaint I get a lot about Dominion. Well, Dominion's just multiplayer solitaire. I build my deck, my opponent builds his deck, and when the provinces are gone, we see how many points we got, and whoever did better wins. Well, maybe if you think about it like that, but I'm going to go out there and say that if you think Dominion is multiplayer solitaire, then you're doing it wrong. There is a whole facet of the game where you need to be paying attention to what your opponent is doing, and it's independent of all Kingdom cards that may be available. It only requires victory cards. Particularly, an example in a vacuum of this would be provinces. The game's over when they're gone. So if there are 2 provinces left, and you can buy a province now, well, maybe it's not such a good idea to buy it. Maybe if you bought a duchy to take the lead, thinking, oh, maybe I'll hit province next turn. If you can buy the last province of the game, that's pretty powerful. If you're first player, then you got one more turn than everyone else, and chances are you probably scored points with that turn. If you're not first player, you want to deny that advantage to your opponents, or particularly the first player. So, positioning yourself for the end game in order to buy the last province and have the lead when you buy the last province is something you have to pay attention to your opponents in order to do. So there's something called the penultimate province rule, which is a little more discrete version of this that applies to two-player games, and I'll link to some articles about that if you really want to know all about it. But this endgame positioning requires paying attention to your opponents, and I promise you, if you're not aware of that and you just buy a province when you can, there are games you will lose because you're not paying attention to that and your opponent is. If you're not paying attention to what your opponent is doing at all times, you're going to do worse than someone who is. So multiplayer solitaire, not so much. You really have to pay attention. It may be a little more difficult and a little more subtle than some of these other things, but it's just as important. Well, that's all I've got to say about interaction for right now. Next video, we're going to cover some terms, a glossary of terms that a lot of nerds use, like myself, to talk about things in Dominion. So, until next time, thanks for watching.